motion for debate today is that this House would arm local militia to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. In opening government, we have Auckland A. In closing, we sort of like that. In closing government, we have Seattle A. Still unsure. In opening opposition, we have Helsinki A. And in closing opposition, we have Victoria Wellington. Great, so we know who wins the crowd. Now, what we do, standing orders being the same as they all have been, I call upon the Prime Minister to open the case for Auckland A and the government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, there's an increasing recognition that when a foreign power enters a difficult Western region, it invariably fails because it has no localised knowledge and no localised ability to tackle difficult areas in that terrain. And also because there's often a perception that's created that an outside superpower is interfering with local areas. That's what happened in Vietnam, Mr. Speaker. That's what happened for a while in Iraq. But last year, Mr. Speaker, the US began to arm local militias in Iraq and armed Shia and Sunni militias that were often called the Sons of Iraq. And that has led partially to the success in the surge of Iraq. We believe that the same strategy can be applied to Afghanistan with a great deal of success. So what are we proposing very simply from opening government? There are local militias in Afghanistan at the moment that feel alienated because they have not been enlisted by US forces and NATO forces in Afghanistan. We would enlist those local militias that are currently performing informal police roles, and we would ensure that they are given equipment and given training and given money, importantly, so that they can carry out roles as part of the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan. In exchange for that equipment and that money, we would have a constant process of review, as is the case in Iraq, such that we can ensure that high performance is achieved. We're going to do this for three reasons, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, we believe that the devolution of military activity in Afghanistan will lead to progress against in the war against the Taliban. Secondly, we believe the perception is really important in the war in Afghanistan, and we believe that the perception of military forces will be improved by the local buy-in that we get. And thirdly, we think we can improve regional stability, particularly on the border in Pakistan. But firstly, let's look at how devolution works and how this is going to lead to progress. I've got 4 sub-points that I want to talk about within this heading. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that knowledge of the terrain and the environment is crucial. We think that Afghanistan is a particularly tricky country in which to fight a war. That's because of the high mountains, that's because of a number of things, Mr. Speaker. We say it's especially hard when you're fighting a guerrilla force like the Taliban that's scattered and has no centralised organisational structure. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, that the knowledge provided by the US Army simply isn't there because the US Army hasn't spent years in Afghanistan. Moreover, we say that the Afghan Army really can't provide that localised knowledge. It's invariably focused in Kabul, in centralised areas, and isn't based in these regional areas. And we say, moreover, in many cases the Afghan Army is poorly trained because it's people that don't otherwise have a job that just go along and fight for the heck of it. So we say that local militias that we enlist have this local knowledge. We think that knowledge of the terrain and how to find out where the Taliban is and how to root them out is really important in achieving progress. But on a secondary level, we think that having a presence in these outposts, a constant presence, is really important. Because as I've already indicated, we say that often the Afghan army is grounded in Kabul and grounded in Kandahar and sometimes makes tours of the regional areas, but doesn't have a constant presence in these regions. We think it makes these regions particularly vulnerable to Taliban attack, and we think, ladies and gentlemen, that we reduce that vulnerability when we ensure that there's a presence there that deters those kinds of random attacks. Yeah. On a third level, no thank you sir, we think that centralised command has been particularly inefficient in Afghanistan, and we think that the bureaucracy that's been put in place by the Afghan government hasn't ensured that there's easy devolution to these regional areas. So we think we reduce that inefficiency and that bureaucracy, Polly.
Do you think that we were successful the last time we funded local militia groups in Afghanistan?
Polly, we think that there hasn't really been a concerted effort to fund local militia groups in Afghanistan. We think that there has been an effort in Iraq, and we think that that has been successful. Fourthly, in terms of why devolution is good, we think that we prevent these organisations from being taken by the Taliban. We say that these organisations are not a natural ally of the Taliban. Indeed, when the Taliban was in power, a lot of them were fighting the Taliban, and they have a vested interest in trying to reduce the bloodshed in their communities. But we say, ladies and gentlemen, that at the moment, when they feel alienated alienated and when they're not given American support, there's a good chance that they fall to the Taliban side. We say when we enlist them, we ensure that that kind of alienation doesn't occur, and we ensure that we reach progress. So on this first point about devolution, we think that actually allowing local forces and empowering them to fight on their own is a really good thing, and we think it's especially useful in the context of Afghanistan, where we're fighting the Taliban. Let's move on to the second point, which is about perception. Because we say one of the major issues in Afghanistan, and the major reasons why there hasn't been progress, is because there is a perception that the Americans are an outside force intervening in an area that's not theirs. We think this perception extends to the Afghan army as well, because the Afghan army is often seen as an American construct, something that's been bolstered merely by US support. We want to change that perception, and that's why we're addressing it. We say in 3 ways we change that perception in a positive way. Firstly, we allow more bottom-up support rather than the kind of top-down imposition that we have from the Americans and from the Afghan army. We think that's really important because we think that when communities see that the people that they know are carrying out the acts in war, we think that it's less likely that they'll turn against the Taliban and the US, sorry. And then we say, secondly, actually having local buy-in allows support to be engendered within these communities in a number of ways. Firstly, we say these local militias already have influence in their communities. They're already really respected in their communities. They have links to local elderly groups, the Jurgas. They have respect in terms of what they do in their informal police roles. We say when they're seen to be taking sides in this conflict and supporting the Americans, we think a lot of young people and a lot of other people in these communities will come on side. We think that enlarges the size of these local militias and ensures greater chances of success. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we think this leads to a more coordinated response. We think perception of that coordination is really important as well, because we think at the moment there's this perception that things are scattered, that there's no unified approach to fight the Taliban, and we think that that leads to a greater incentive for the Taliban to make random attacks. So in terms of perception, we think that we change the idea that there is an outside force intervening. We think that reduces support for Taliban, and we think on the ground it leads to greater progress. Just briefly on this third point about regional stability, my Deputy Prime Minister is going to expand on this, but we say there are lawless tribal belts in Pakistan where Taliban forces are spilling over. We say there's nothing to stop that as long as local militias aren't enlisted. And this is particularly problematic because we don't have a coherent strategy on either sides of the borders. We think that this will lead to a coherent strategy, and my Deputy Prime Minister is going to tell you exactly why. So what have we brought to you from Oakland Government? We say currently there's no unified, coordinated strategy, and just as in Vietnam, we have a Western power that's trying to intervene without the local, particularised knowledge that's needed for there to be success. We seek to change that situation. We think enlisting local militias is the way to do it. We stand proudly in proposition.
Thank you very much for your speech, and I now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for Helsinki A.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker. What we're going to do for you in this debate is analyse 3 particular areas. We are going to ask the question of whether this is a problem of the magnitude which they have described. We're going to give you some analysis of the situation of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Then we're going to talk about how whatever short-term benefits they can point to, and we think they are minimal, the long-term security and prosperity of Afghanistan is not aided by this policy. And finally, we're going to talk about the distinct nature of weapons as sort of intangible methods of coercion, Mr. Speaker. Inflexible methods of coercion, Mr. Speaker. Once you put them there, they stay there. That's a problem. Let's start with some rebuttal, though, Mr. Speaker. They talked a lot about the US arming insurgencies in Iraq and used that as a precedent for it. Now, what we say in the first place is we're not convinced that that has worked in the long term, Mr. Speaker. We say there has been a short-term reduction in problems in Iraq. It's not at all clear that that's to do with this policy rather than the surge itself. And they can't just assert that. They have to show you that, Mr. Speaker. What we say is, fundamentally, the policy of arming insurgents in Iraq had a different rationale as to theirs. They said the policy of arming insurgents in Iraq, was to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. To some extent, that has been successful. However, what we have seen is that there are now many groups of well-armed militias drawn across ethnic and religious lines. And what we see, Mr. Speaker, is a corresponding decrease in the united nature of Iraq. We've seen we have empowered local actors in a way that totally undermines the central authority in Iraq, Mr. Speaker. And so he's saying, whatever short-term reduction in violence you see, the long-term harms in destabilising the country from their policy, Mr. Speaker, are evident, and we don't want the same to happen in Afghanistan. Now we talk about local militias, Mr. Speaker, we think they've been disingenuous here also. They talked about these kind of like police-style local militias who do everything from like solving crime to helping the elderly, Mr. Speaker. We just don't think that's the kind of militias that you have in Afghanistan. If people are armed and organised in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, it's generally because they're part of wider networks which nearly always trace back to some kind of local warlord, Mr. Speaker, with massive criminal and violent connections. Now what we're saying, Mr. Speaker, is again, we're not entirely sure enlarging those systems are good, and we're not entirely sure that those people are the kind of people that we want as role models in Afghanistan. We don't think they've given you a very credible idea of what the militias in Afghanistan are like. I will talk more about warlords later. Finally, Mr. Speaker, this very debate-style issue of the perception of this, Mr. Speaker. Like, we're just not sure there is like a mass consciousness in Afghanistan in the first place, due to the sort of lack of media they have. But we think like, the perception issue is weak for a number of reasons, Mr. Speaker. And they said, oh, well maybe if people like start encountering local people instead of the US, then maybe they'll be more friendly to the occupation. And what we're saying, Mr. Speaker, is that people already don't encounter the US. They've told you local militias do the governing, so they're not going to encounter the US any more or any less if you arm the local militias, Mr. Speaker. There's no perceptible difference in perception at all. Go, sir.
Okay. You're saying the Sunni awakening wasn't successful. My question to you is, was the central government more or less able to do its job in 2006 or in 2008?
Again, you're just drawing like a totally absurd dichotomy. Like, we say the major difference between 2006 and 2008 is the surge in the first place. We say the central government actually is less able to operate now. Yes, there is more security because there's less Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but the central government is totally paralysed by the ethnic forces in Iraq, which you've now empowered, divided across ethnic lines, and made totally unable to cooperate. We say the lack of a functioning central government, we say political stagnation in Iraq is a direct result of your policy. We don't think the government functions better now, even if there's less bombings, and we think that's a long-term problem. Let's move on to my main points, Mr. Speaker. How will this exactly exacerbate Afghanistan's problems? And we say, like, the idea that the Taliban is the only roadblock to progress there is simply fallacious. What we say is the Taliban is now mostly excluded to southern Afghanistan, the Helmand province. The vast majority of Afghanistan they're not active in, and yet the central government still has problems projecting its power there. We say that's because the central government is genuinely in tension with these other groups, Mr. Speaker, of warlords. Now what we say is, if we're going to say that like the Taliban is not necessarily as big a problem, we do accept we have to present something of an alternative model of development in Afghanistan, and we think we can do that. We think we can point to the central authority in Afghanistan, which has been fairly successful within a given territory, of bringing security, and not just bringing security, but bringing a style of governance to Afghanistan, which we think is inherently good, a secular style, Mr. Speaker, a style based on like a united Afghanistan, not divided across factional lines. And what we say is, Mr. Speaker, by supporting that central government, we can expand that to wider areas of Afghanistan. Sure, it's going to be slow, but this country hasn't been governed for 2,000 years. We can't just magic it and hope things are going to be okay overnight. So we say that's what we should be supporting, and this is inherently in tension with that. Why is it? We say one of the major problems the central government has is rampant crime, things like drug trafficking, all across Afghanistan. And we say it's these very local militias they want to arm that are involved in this in the first place, Mr. Speaker. What we say is basically, very simply, by giving them guns, you empower them dramatically. We say if they are in tension with the central government, that's a fundamental problem for the central government to expand its power, and it puts limits on what that can ever do in Afghanistan. We say essentially this is the same perspective we took on Africa. We said, oh look, these people look a bit tribal, they tend to separate into groups. Let's reify those tribal lines by giving them all guns, turning them against each other, and then maybe everything will be okay in the long run. We think that's absolutely mad. We think a united Afghanistan is the way forward, and we think there is a model for that in the first place. Let me talk about the distinct nature of weapons. Why are they such a problem, Mr. Speaker? What we say is fundamentally, we do not need more soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. The problem we have is one of intelligence. We have soldiers, we have good soldiers, and we're going to have more soldiers once we take them out of Iraq, Mr. Speaker. What we say is the problem we have with the Taliban is not a lack of fighting capability, it's a lack of intelligence. It's simply not knowing where they are. And we say giving people guns doesn't give you any information about where the Taliban are because the Taliban don't tell you. What we say fundamentally, if we need from these sort of tribal leaders, is intelligence, Mr. Speaker. We say there are better ways of getting intelligence from them than trading guns. We can do other kinds of favours, Mr. Speaker. We can shower them with luxuries like we already do. What we say is guns are a particular problem because they don't disappear. If you're giving someone, say, like, intangible aid, like luxuries or finance, Mr. Speaker, if they turn against you, or if they stop being helpful, you could withdraw those. If you have given them 100 Kalashnikovs and they stop cooperating with you, they still have 100 Kalashnikovs and they will for the next 40 or 50 years. We say weapons are a totally inflexible policy, Mr. Speaker, for the kind of intelligence that we need. We don't want to use them. And we see the trouble that happens in countries like Somalia, where weapons are kicking around forever. Finally then, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to turn to this issue of just how how in the long term this is going to be a flawed policy. So what we've said then fundamentally is you are exacerbating the divides in Afghanistan. What we say is we need a centralised authority which is going to expand and take control of these areas over a period of years, Mr. Speaker. We say weapons stop that happening because they empower the very people who are blocking progress in the first place, Mr. Speaker. They increase the problem of drugs and the problem of crime, which we say is a roadblock to progress, Mr. Speaker. We say the Taliban are not anything like significant enough problem for us to risk this destabilisation. We say we have alternative methods such as intelligence gathering, Mr. Speaker, such as adding extra Western troops to deal with them, Mr. Speaker. And what we say fundamentally is we want to build an Afghanistan along the model that we have already in place, a centralised authority along relatively secular lines, Mr. Speaker, bringing Afghans together, not dividing them. We haven't seen the compelling need, Mr. Speaker. We haven't seen this policy will work in the long term, and for those reasons, it will be reckless to adopt it. We beg to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, and I call the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for Auckland A.
Ladies and gentlemen, we feel that one of the basic new things that we've learned in the past 6 months or so in Iraq is that in order to influence local situations and in order to achieve long-term change, we need to have some sort of end to violence in the short term, ladies and gentlemen. And we've recognized that that end to violence in the short term occurs when we engage with local communities, when we engage with local networks, ladies and gentlemen, and when we empower those structures and when we deal with that. And that is why we think that this is a good idea on-site proposition, ladies and gentlemen. I'll do a number of things for you today. I'll look at this vague idea that somehow there's no problem to begin with, ladies and gentlemen, this attempt by opening opposition to diminish the nature of the problem. I'll then look at this idea of long-term versus short-term changes in security, ladies and gentlemen. And lastly, I'll look at the idea of regional stability, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at whether or not there is a problem. Because we had really 3 arguments raised in here. The first argument raised was that, well, this isn't really, perception really isn't a problem, that we don't need to change perceptions, ladies and gentlemen. This engages with the substantive that Max brought up, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a number of responses to that. One, ladies and gentlemen, that's just blatantly false, because when we talk about the war on terrorism, we talk about winning hearts and minds, we talk about changing people's perception towards the West, we talk about changing people's perception towards their central government, we talk about changing people's perceptions towards America, ladies and gentlemen, and we think that perception and buy-in from the local populace is fundamentally important in winning this, ladies and gentlemen, and fundamentally important in instilling some sort of confidence in the central government. We think that one of the key reasons that you get confidence in the central government by changing perception is by making sure that there are less bombings in the short run, ladies and gentlemen, something that we think will be achieved under this. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we had an issue raised here by opening opposition in terms of this idea that Taliban are diminished, that they're only operating in Bamyan, ladies and gentlemen. Again, that's just false, ladies and gentlemen, because we've seen a resurgence in Taliban. We've seen, ladies and gentlemen, NATO supply routes actively pummeled by the Taliban in the last 15 days or so, ladies and gentlemen. We've seen 50 NATO Humvees burnt, ladies and gentlemen, in the Helmand province. So that's just wrong. We see that the Taliban are coming back, ladies and gentlemen. We see that the Taliban are resurgent, and we say that that's why we need to engage in this. Third problem we had raised was that, well, this isn't a shortage of manpower, this is a shortage of intelligence, ladies and gentlemen. Again, number of responses to that. One, this is a shortage of manpower, ladies and gentlemen. It's something that's recognized by the US, by NATO, by Barack Obama himself. But also, even if this is about the shortage of intelligence, ladies and gentlemen, we say that the best way to gain intelligence is to engage with local intelligence networks, ladies and gentlemen, and to make sure that people who are part of those local intelligence networks are on your side, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that it's quite hard to do that if you're a white operative from the CIA. Much easier to do that, ladies and gentlemen, when you have some control over the militias who take part in these local intelligence networks, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at this idea of long-term versus short-term change, ladies and gentlemen. We say that strengthening the central authority is one of the key fundamentals of this debate, ladies and gentlemen. And side opposition here believe that doing anything would diminish the power of central government by empowering these militias. We say that that's wrong, ladies and gentlemen. We say that when you look at the example of Iraq, you say that a cessation in violence in the short term creates a scenario, ladies and gentlemen, where the people are more likely to engage in negotiation, conversation, and compromise in the long run, ladies and gentlemen, and even within the short term. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, we've seen that when we diminished the violence in the short term in Iraq, we had greater consensus on the Iraqi constitution, ladies and gentlemen. We had greater consensus on the structure of government in Iraq. We had greater consensus on the makeup of the army in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen. And so we think that that's good. But also, ladies and gentlemen, we say that when you reduce violence, you reduce the chances of radicalization of political parties, ladies and gentlemen, that are involved in the central government, ladies and gentlemen, because they feel they have to take less radical measures, because there's less people being killed, ladies and gentlemen, there's less democratic pressure by their constituencies on them to do something quite radical, ladies and gentlemen. But so that's that done with, ladies and gentlemen. Another point raised in this idea of long-term security was this idea of warlords, that we shouldn't be empowering warlords because these are bad people, ladies and gentlemen. Again, no contextual analysis of this. We say that warlords emerged in Afghanistan because of the lack of central government, ladies and gentlemen. That warlords are there to provide security to their communities, ladies and gentlemen. That warlord structures are inherently intertwined with tribal structures, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why you see community buy-in, ladies and gentlemen. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, you believe warlords making sure that they listen to local tribal jirgas, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you feel that local communities exercise some pressure on them, which is often more than the pressure that they're able to exercise on the central government. Yes, Polly?
Do you think that the US funding of the Kurds in Iraq during the 80s and 90s under Saddam Hussein led to more or less violence against Kurds?
Thanks, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that this is fundamentally different, because that was violence that we incentivized to be instigated against a central government, ladies and gentlemen. This, on the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, is us empowering local militias to fight on the side of the central government, ladies and gentlemen. So there's a fundamental distinction in that we are actually not engaging in that fight against the central government here. So let's look at warlords again, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that local communities are able to exercise some sort of influence on them. Lastly, this idea raised under long-term harms of the war on drugs and more guns, ladies and gentlemen. One, we say that these militias already have a crap load of guns, ladies and gentlemen. They're not walking around bare armed. So you're not actually having this debate in the context of no guns and lots of guns, ladies and gentlemen. You're having this debate in the context of a lot of guns and slightly more guns, ladies and gentlemen, but actually on our side and having some control over them. But on the war on drugs, ladies and gentlemen, we say that the war on drugs occurs in an environment where the central government is unable to exercise its influence over areas like Bamiyan, over areas like Helmand, over areas like the Durand line on the border with Pakistan, ladies and gentlemen. We think that these militias provide continued involvement in these areas, ladies and gentlemen, and that continued presence leads to better ability to exercise control over that. Let's look at this idea of regional stability, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, we think that because of the changed perception and because of the community buy-in, there's less incentives for people from across Asia, from Pakistan, to come into Afghanistan and fight for the Taliban. Secondly, we say that the continued presence of these tribal groups, ladies and gentlemen, across the border means that they're better able to police. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, and fundamentally, we think it's best because they're able to create some sort of consensus on both sides of the border, ladies and gentlemen. We say that international governments, that NATO has been unable to do that, ladies and gentlemen. We say that tribes like the Hazara tribe and the Afridi tribe, who have their own militias, ladies and gentlemen, and who are on both sides of the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan, and have local jirgas, ladies and gentlemen, twice a year or 3 times a year, that have tribes from both sides of the border come in and talk about things, ladies and gentlemen, are better able to negotiate and exercise control over tribes on the other side of the border, ladies and gentlemen. And they're in a better position to gain some concessions out of these tribes, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that because of that better ability to negotiate and exercise concessions, ladies and gentlemen, we feel that they will be able to gain better outcomes, and they will be able to better get those tribal communities on the other side of the border to engage and solve this problem, ladies and gentlemen. So what have you shown today? We've shown you that the devolution, ladies and gentlemen, allows access to local knowledge and a constant presence. We've shown you that the devolution allows a change in perception because these people engage with the community. And lastly, we've shown you that it means that we have better regional stability because they're able to gain a better consensus on both sides of the border, and that's why we're going to
This is gonna be a challenge. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you very much for the floor, Mr. Speaker. During the Cold War, the US armed a group called the Taliban to fight a group called the Russians, who was the US's arch enemy. During the War on Terror, we're funding local militias to fight the US's arch enemy, who is the Taliban. Mr. Speaker, I think I can see a pattern. So, what we're essentially saying on this side of the house is that you can't fight asymmetric warfare with bad intelligence and more guns. Rich has provided you a good way to fight this war that has all the effects that they want without any of the costs and the overspill problems. What I'm going to do in my speech is talk more about this idea of exacerbating tensions within Afghanistan and how in the long term this completely destabilizes the country and how it doesn't achieve any of the things that they wanted to achieve. The only substantial thing that they brought on their side of the house was that this will change perception. And of course there was that point that they forgot about how China will hate this. But I think we can all safely just deal with perception in the debate lingo. So, I'm going to talk about exacerbating conflicts in the long term. What we say is that this completely destabilizes central government. Because a central government needs effective control of the territory. That is the very definition of a governed country, Mr. Speaker. Now, you only have the effective control of your territory if you have a monopoly on violence and if you have a monopoly on your armed forces. We say, by arming forces that have nothing to do with that central government, you are completely undermining it. They point to 6 months of arming groups in Iraq. And we say we have given you a perfectly viable alternative to why that has apparently worked, and we think it's the surge. We think it's more policing done by legitimate forces. But also, we point to Somalia, which is the very definition of a failed state, a region which we essentially flooded with guns in the 90s, Mr. Speaker, and which now we see is completely ungovernable. So they have to deal with the example of Somalia, which has been around for the past 20 years and which is in no way close to being effectively governed. And I have to deal with 6 months in Iraq. I think they have a higher burden to prove than we do. Then there's this idea of losing, we're winning hearts and minds, right? And you don't win hearts and minds with guns. More guns means more killing. More guns means more violence. Nobody's going to be won over by the massive amounts of violence you're inducing, right? We say you can win hearts and minds by doing what the American army has actually been doing on the ground in Iraq, by just going into villages, funding local people, but giving them food and supplies and stuff like that in exchange for intelligence. The problem with guns is that guns stick around. You eat a baguette, but you will forever keep, and you can't really do much harm with the baguette after you eat it. But with the Kalashnikov, you won't be bound to the American army by eternal gratefulness and love for them, and forever have this bond that will honor bound you to it. We say that we can't trust these warlords, right? In the same way as we couldn't trust the Taliban. They have no morals, they have no principles, they just will turn against us, they will go with the highest bidder. Why? Give us one single reason why in the long run we can trust these warlords to actually do effective policing for us and be reliable allies in the long term. We don't think you can. These are people who are running the drug crops. These are people who are the problem in Afghanistan to begin with. This is not the local volunteer militia who's just doing community service and providing services needed for the community. They're walking around with guns. Really, guys, seriously, they don't really look that friendly to the local population. We say that ultimately, on one thing you're right, we need more information. And the way we fight the Taliban is by knowing where they are, because they're in like small pocketed regions, and you're like, oh, they're a bigger problem than you say they are, because like they're like a million Humvees exploded in the Helmand province. That's what Rich said. They're in the Helmand province. That's in the south. That's on the border with Taliban, with Afghanistan. So you're saying that we have a problem because we proved, and I'll take the second half in a second. We have a problem because we proved that they are where we said they were. Go ahead, sir.
You keep pointing out that you're going to have fundamental problems with these not being reliable groups, but you identified the one reason why they will be in your speech. They go to the highest bidder. I think we have more money than the Taliban.
Okay, maybe there's an economic meltdown, sir, right now. China is soaring. Like, seriously, can you anticipate that 10, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, we'll still be the highest bidder? We were the highest bidder for the Taliban in the 1980s. Then they turned against us. Like, we don't know what will happen. Well, unless you're like extremely clairvoyant, congratulations to you, sir. You can't guarantee to me that in 5, 10, 15 years, these people will still be around and on our side. The Kalashnikovs will still be around. And that's what we have a problem with. We say that you're essentially playing on the same things that you have played in Africa, on the tribalization and on dividing the country. You have democratic elections and you put a government into place, and then you completely undermine it by arming local forces that have nothing to do with that government. Instead of creating a united perception, I'm sorry I used the word perception, I don't know what's wrong with me. Instead of creating a united Afghanistan and a united nation that you can effectively govern by a legitimate use of force, you're destabilizing it by the use of weapons, which will forever be around, long after you're gone, long after you know what happens. And we say that you need information, you can get that information by like supporting the locals, but not with guns. Just support them with food, with like goods, with whatever else you need. You have to show us why guns are so important. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Seattle A.
Well, Mr. Speaker and members of this House, I'm going to begin with a little bit of refutation. I think it falls into two categories. One is largely magic-based arguments that have been made by the opposition side, and the other ones are just disanalogous examples, and I think we can hit those down as well. The positive material, which will be the majority of my speech, is focusing on two distinct categories. The first is that we need to have in this debate real standards and ratios for success. We need to know what success looks like and how we actually achieve it. Now, what government provided us with so far is the mechanism for it. We want to be able to show you exactly why this mechanism achieves what is universally recognized as being necessary for stability. Now, the second is to be able to recognize the political limitations on what they've described for us. But now first, I'd like to be able to address in refutation a few things. First, the majority of their substantive material comes out to something to this effect. Guns are permanent, they're more dangerous than baguettes, and you can't eat them. Ladies and gentlemen, first off, if you soak a Kalashnikov, you can eat it, wood is digestible, but more importantly, these militias already have guns, that's why they're militias. And so when it comes to a matter of adding it, you're adding marginal additional firearms to ones that are already there. But this is where they come up with something really creative. They say, well, how do you know that you're going to get their loyalty? Well, they then say they go to the highest bidder. And when we say we can probably outbid the Taliban, they say, but there's been an economic meltdown. So apparently the Taliban's internal economy, which far outweighs that of the United States at this point, I guess their future stocks really worked out well for them. That's admirable. Maybe we could buy them out and recruit them onto our Wall Street. That would work out well. But perhaps you'd like to be able to refute that.
So, like, if they are militias with lots of guns, why would they be interested in having more guns if they don't need?
Okay. So they say go to the highest bidder. Apparently they have all the guns they need, in which case that saves us money because now we don't need to buy them more guns. We can buy them off with other things. Let me give you an example. CBS reported just last week, this gives you an idea of the people that we're dealing with, that the CIA has found it very effective to use Viagra to bribe out the elderly patriarchs of these militias with waning libidos. And that's a real example. You can look at the article afterwards. It's very exciting. But Viagra pills is enough to be able to buy these people out. Now, in addition, we'd be able to say that for them, they say the alternative here is more coalition troops, more central government, less militia, and also more intelligence. Where do they come from? You cannot cast Coalition Summoning 5 and get more troops. They need to come from somewhere. And at the same time, you cannot cast Fox's Cunning, these are real Dungeons & Dragons spells, by the way, and to be able to increase your level of intelligence. The gap in intelligence right now in Afghanistan comes from human intelligence. That's the gap. You need local support to get that. You don't get it by putting more Predator drones and accidentally blowing up weddings and caravans. You need to have people on the ground telling you where people are, where your enemies are. Now, in addition to this, we'd also act that the limitation right now on the number of troops is not willpower. It's not the central government thinking, well, maybe we have enough to be able to provide security when we can't protect the road in between Kandahar and Kabul. Highway 1, the most important road in Afghanistan, they can't protect it currently. It's because you need a certain number of people, usually foreigners, to be able to train up your military, and you need a number of volunteers. Those numbers don't exist. Now, what they're suggesting to you in this case is that instead of drawing upon these militias for additional numbers, we should have an antagonistic relation to them. I'm going to explain later on why that's specifically bad. But first off, let's say, how many people on the ground do we need right now to achieve stability and success in Afghanistan? Because that's not a point of contention in this debate. Both sides want a stable, prosperous Afghanistan at the end of this. Now, Afghanistan has about 32 million people in it. It's not exactly a small country. And right now, you're talking about something that's about 100,000 coalition troops, or it's 100,000 providing security. Now, Gates wants to be able to increase, this is the Secretary of Defense for the United States, wants to increase the number to 200,000 ANSF, and they're including 20,000 additional coalition troops in the upcoming months. Now that helps. How many do you actually need? Well, the ratio that is presented by Colonel Nagel, who literally wrote the book on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism for the United States and the coalition troops, this is the standard that we're using. He's an ally of General Petraeus. This is the number that we're looking for, is 50 civilians for every 1 security personnel. That means you need 600,000 people providing security. And just in case they think that this is some sort of arbitrary thing, that if you use a Batman model of one person who's really intelligent and very crafty, you can provide it, that sort of ratio system, on a bad day in New York, the current ratio that we have in Afghanistan would be inadequate. They need to address how we're going to be able to make up that gap. Perhaps you have an answer.
Right. So, you're saying Petraeus wants to massively increase the number of troops in Afghanistan. My question to you is he a magician?
They're putting in 20,000. That's what we can spare. Now, you need to explain if they're going to just keep on doing that. It's not an endless reserve. They have 20,000 because they can afford to do it because of the overwhelming success of the surge in Iraq, which follows similar principles to what we're doing now. That's why they have the troops to spare. Now, in addition, why was the surge successful in the first place? This is another example of the standard that we were talking about. The surge was not just throwing 20,000 American troops into Iraq. There was gaining the support of hundreds of thousands of militiamen in the Al-Anbar province, and that allowed us to be able to redistribute coalition forces into hotspot areas such as Baghdad to be able to provide additional security, which incidentally, yes, has strengthened the central government immeasurably and provides a lot more legitimacy when you don't have death squads that wear government uniforms in territories they have no place to be, killing innocent men, women, and children. So yes, sometimes separating groups in this case is pretty advantageous. Now, when they're trying to point out additional disanalogous sort of examples, they say that this is just like when we were funding the Mujahideen. They've already acknowledged that this was an example of the warlords are largely mercenary. The Mujahideen was not. They had strong ideological opposition to the West. They had no desire whatsoever to cooperate with us, and it wasn't like they pretended to get along with us. It was something they didn't say, we love American disco. As soon as they were going to be done with the Soviets, they were turning on us next. The CIA knew it and funded it anyway. What are the political limitations that we look at? We've already established that we have a certain number. We can't get it through other means. You need to be recruiting and support and gaining the support of these militiamen. We can show you why, and have shown you why, this won't result in blowback. You have a choice in this House right now as to what the relationship will be between the central government and these militia. Either you are going to increase the number of enemies you have, which is what they're proposing. They're saying that these militias are bad, the central government needs to be fighting with them, they need to have an antagonistic relation with them, and they simultaneously say that you need to have ground-level support and intelligence. Those are mutually exclusive aims. What we're saying is follow the old principle of consuming from your enemy the resources you need to fight, turn potential enemies into your allies. This is a road towards success within Afghanistan. You need to find a way of clearing the gap of 400,000 when 1 out of 15 people in Afghanistan have links to local militia. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how you bridge the gap between 200,000 and 600,000 and make it so that you no longer have a circumstance which is like a perverse system of musical chairs where coalition forces leave into town in Afghanistan, the Taliban moves in. When we strike, NATO forces have been killing more civilians than the Taliban. We need to stop that. This is the way to do it.
Government that what we need in Afghanistan is a ratio for success, which is apparently more troops on the ground. We'd say that, on the contrary, the ratio that you need for success is the prospect of long-term civil society being successful in Afghanistan, and that what you're doing is directly contradictory to the potential of gaining civil society and the democratic institutions you need with it. What we're going to be bringing you from Closing Opposition today is an analysis of how, first of all, the aims of the government at this present time, in terms of the government in this debating room, not a government over a nation, the effect of that on civilians at the present time is actually going to have a negative impact on those civilians. But in the long term, in terms of civil society, because we can't predict the aims and the goals of these people that we're giving resources to, that you can't actually guarantee the emergence of that civil society and any long-term success for it. So first of all, let's actually have a look at the immediate effect on civilians, because what you're being told on this side of the house is that we need to bring down the Taliban and this is going to be good for citizens and civilians in Afghanistan. But what we'd say, and we brought this up in a point of information, is that when you all of a sudden tie civilians to the very forces that the Taliban dislikes, the very forces that the Taliban is trying to fight against, you tie those civilians to the notion that they are tools of the imperialist America. What you do, ladies and gentlemen, is increase the amount of violence that is used indiscriminately against regions or towns or a part of a region that is host to a militia who is receiving things such as guns and weapons from the USA. And we gave an example of this, ladies and gentlemen, where we said that when we funded the Kurds, under Saddam Hussein in the 1990s and the 1980s, in that situation you saw an increase of violence against them and those civilians from Saddam because they were linked with the very forces who Saddam was fighting against. And what was the response to this when we raised this in a point of information? We were told, oh no, that was different because in that situation you were encouraging a fight against the central government. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the same no matter where you are if you're encouraging a fight against the people who have the power to then go and persecute you, ladies and gentlemen, which is why often when we give these small groups things such as food and fuels, you see retaliations against them. At the moment, you have random militia who will do things such as a surprise car bomb in one of the towns or cities in Afghanistan, which is often very hard to link back to somebody. As soon as you have to start, what you're going to put under review every 6 months or something, some system of directly channeling arms to these people, all of a sudden you make it a lot easier for the Taliban to target who exactly is providing the internal resistance. And we believe that that's going to lead to more violence against these groups of people who are perhaps linked to them because of family or community groups. That is a harm to these people by being linked with America, ladies and gentlemen, and the forces in Afghanistan. But something bigger and something broader, no thank you sir, that we want to bring to this debate is to look at the actual end goal in this game. And once again, we raise this in a point of information, because it's always a little bit funny when you get into debates and people use lots of examples about other countries, when actually there's the perfect example of the country itself that we're talking about, Mr. Speaker. Because we've tried this before in Afghanistan, which has been raised already. But what we'd say is that when you actually provide an analysis of what happened in Afghanistan during the 70s and the 80s when we were fighting the USSR via these local militia groups, that you actually destroy the potential for civil society. And I'll accept you, sir.
The Taliban is already targeting food supply and drugs in these communities. Don't we unify these communities, if anything, against the Taliban?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, your idea that apparently young children are going to go, do you know what, I reckon the USA is great and I'm going to be pro-USA for the rest of my life. How did that work, Max, when we funded these groups in the 80s and 90s and you saw that very generation you're talking about that's supposed to band together to help your cause then turn into the very Taliban that we see here today? So that we say that in terms of civil society, one of the most necessary things that you need is a belief in democratic institutions and ways of doing things. Ways of actually making laws and legislating and exercising power. When you give a group, ladies and gentlemen, a huge amount of resources and a huge amount of arms, and the hope that at the moment they share the same goals as you, so maybe in the future they will, you don't actually set up the foundations for that very civil society that you want. But let's look a bit deeper, ladies and gentlemen, because the very militia groups that you talk about are already the people who are predisposed to not acting in a democratic way or not acting in a way that recognises that you can exercise power without having to use violent means. No thank you, sir. We believe in this situation, you exactly set up a scenario where once the Taliban have been defeated, is what you're saying is going to happen, that all of a sudden you have people with a huge amount of resources who think that they are the right people to exercise power and that others shouldn't, which is what happened, ladies and gentlemen, when we supported the Mujahideen in the 80s and in the 70s against Russia. That very same cohort, that very same generation of people then decided that they didn't actually have the same goals all along as the USA and as the forces that were fighting against Russia in Afghanistan. They decided that no, they didn't want to have belief in and use democratic institutions. Instead, what they wanted to do was to use power and exercise it through force. So you have the very situation that we have today because those groups who didn't have the beliefs that we wanted them to have all of a sudden had power and resources. No thank you, sir. So ladies and gentlemen, when you look at what you need for civil society, you see that that's not what's being provided on this side of the house. Today, you've had one side, the government, which wants to tell us that apparently just throwing some arms at groups which apparently already have enough arms, ladies and gentlemen, and so it's not going to matter that much, is going to solve the situation you want. There have been a group that's been willing to set up the foundations of what you need for civil society. What they have been willing to do is to act in a way which contradicts what you need for any sort of long-term change. But furthermore, they're a group that wants to link civilians, ladies and gentlemen, who may be attached to these militia groups with the very forces who the Taliban dislike and the very forces who the Taliban call the imperialists. Today, from Closing Opposition, we've been prepared to look at the actual history of Afghanistan and why it didn't work in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, 25% of the population, when we funded them in the 80s, was under the age of 14. They weren't convinced that the USA was the right way to go. They were convinced that using power and using arms was how you succeeded in society. And that's not the situation we want to set up again. For all of those reasons, we are most proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for your speech. And I now call upon the government whip to conclude the case of the Auckland A.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. History is important, but sometimes even historical examples can be disanalogies, and that's exactly the fact that Second Opposition failed to recognize. I'm going to do some rebuttal of the extension they provided in this debate, and then I'm going to sum it up under, I think, two broader questions through which we can see who clearly won today's debate. So, three things. First, they say civil society is the way forward. We want to strengthen civil society. We think that's better than using guns and things which are negative and kill people. Well, I have a couple problems with this. First of all, how do you strengthen civil society? They did not respond one iota of information to Michael's analysis, which says if you want to strengthen the central government, if you want to have concrete civil society and centralized governance which can actually be effective, you need what? Troops. Yes, especially in a context where you have enemies that have guns that are trying to destabilize your central government. We said you need a threshold of 1 security personnel to 50 members of the population, or citizens. They didn't respond to that analysis. They didn't explain whether they're going to increase foreign troop presence in order to actually get to the kind of civil society and the legitimization of the centralized government that they want. I can only assume one of two things then. Either A, they like the status quo and think things are going just peachy as long as we go along with the current plan. I think that's a really bad argument. I hope that's not what they meant. Or two, they actually do want to increase our troop presence by hundreds of thousands from NATO forces and from US forces, and because that's the only way you're actually going to achieve the goals they've established of centralized governance, being legitimate, and wiping out these opium-dealing, really, really nasty, bad warlords who have waning libidos. No, so those are the two options they've given us today in today's debate. I think we've proven that either one of those are inadequate. Okay, if you'd like to clarify it at this point in the speech, because I'm so confused, go ahead.
Okay, we say that we have troops, well-trained troops. What we need is more intelligence for targeted attacks by those troops.
Okay, so they're saying that currently the security apparatus is entirely sufficient absent intelligence, all right? We've already pointed out, here's the security apparatus. 120,000 bad troops, 60,000 of them are US and coalition troops, fairly well-trained troops, 60,000 of them are ragtag Afghan troops, in a country of 32 million people with tribal warlords. They're saying that's a sufficient security apparatus. Secondly, they say we need more intelligence. I don't know how you get intelligence. All I know is that you antagonize the very groups from which you want to get that intelligence. I don't think your plan or your alternative is anything coherent or helpful at this point. Okay, so let's go to their historical examples, because at least those make some sense. First, they say the Kurds example. We gave guns to the Kurds, and then the Kurds weren't all that well off. There's one really important distinction to be made. The Taliban is very much unlike Saddam Hussein, both in terms of the power that he has, or the power that the Taliban has, the lack of, I don't know, chemical, biological, and potentially nuclear weapons. I'm not going to comment on that. I mean, it fundamentally isn't analogous because, frankly, the Taliban cannot do to these armed militias in Afghanistan, once they're armed and supported by the US and the central governments and NATO allies, what Saddam Hussein did to the Kurds. And frankly, there were no US boots on the ground in Iraq to protect the Kurds. That will be the case in Afghanistan. Then they give you this analysis of Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s. And again, I have to point out that the Taliban, with its massive booming economy in comparison to the Western world, is not equivalent to the USSR in the 80s and 90s, which is what their analogy rests on in order for it to be effective. They say, we armed the Mujahideen, and then it worked against them, and now they're coming back against us. I'm saying this simply is not historically analogous, and it fails on that level. What we have right now are militias. These militias are not very pleasant people. They're not people that we necessarily ideologically agree with. However, they are not ideologically aligned with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. They are exactly the kind of people they said they were. That is, people that will go for the highest bidder. My point at this, and our point along the entire government bench, and especially for Michael, is this, that so long as we recognize that they will go for the highest bidder, these are forces we want on our side if we want stability and peace within Afghanistan at this point or at any point in the future. So here are the basic two questions that this debate comes down to. First, what helps to strengthen the central government? And secondly, what is the best policy within the limitations that Michael pointed out, the political limitations which exist? Now, in terms of what helps strengthen the central government, again, Michael's analysis clarified for us what exactly are the standards that we should look to in terms of what would actually legitimize and help strengthen the central government. She summed up in her POI, frankly, at the very last moment, that all that they're increasing to the status quo is more intelligence work. If you'd like to, that's what she said. What would that concrete intelligence work look like? Please go ahead.
What do you think the goals of these militia are going to be once the Taliban have gone?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I was hoping you'd answer my question.
What do you think the goals of these militia are going to be once the Taliban are gone?
I think the goals of the militia are going to be the same that they are right now, and that is if they can get money through opium trade, or if they can get money from the United States. But the fact of the matter is, you enter them into your sphere of influence once they're on your side, and you can enact progressive change. What you're doing is antagonizing them by saying we're going to work against you. That's fundamentally counterintuitive, especially when the only criterion, the only advancement you have over the status quo is increased on-the-ground intelligence. You only get it from these actors. You're alienating them. We're not. We're bringing them within our sphere of influence. Better things can happen once that's the case. Okay, so the question of how to strengthen the central government, I think we've covered this. The point is you need a lot of troops if you want to strengthen the central government. We're able to do that in a way that is politically feasible. We frankly believe that you can't increase the outside troop presence to 600,000. We don't think that's politically viable for President-elect Obama. We don't think that's politically viable for any NATO members at this point. So how do you get to the numbers threshold, the ratio that you need in order to legitimize the central government and create stability within Afghanistan? Well, frankly, the only only way to do it is to get the militias on your side, because they already have guns, unfortunately. I don't know about baguettes, but they have the guns currently, and if they're on our side, they bridge that gap that currently exists within the security apparatus of Afghanistan. So the second point here is within the limitations that exist. We would say a massive troop presence is possible, and the status quo, as it is right now, is a losing status quo. It's a status quo where the central government itself is being consistently delegitimized by its inability to protect the citizens that it is supposed to be protecting. If the only thing they can add to that is that we will increase intelligence, we're not quite sure how we're going to do that, in what way, then we would say that it will not help legitimize the central government, it will only continue the status quo, and that, my friends, is an unfortunate drift into a morbid situation for the people of Afghanistan and for the efforts in Afghanistan to root of terrorism and of other threats, which certainly are not pleasant. Okay, thank you.
The only criteria for the support of militia groups that we've heard from the government benches is that they don't like the Taliban as well. And their logic rests on the idea that the enemy of our enemy is our friend. The problem is history tends to disagree when we no longer have a shared interest and their policy is based on the idea of getting rid of the Taliban. Then those divergent interests take over, and we say they will more often than not be in support of central government and democratic institutions. What I'm going to do for you is two things. Firstly, I'm going to ask how their policy will impact on short-term peace within Afghanistan. And secondly, I'm going to move on and look at how their policy will impact on the chances of long-term success in creating democratic institutions. So let's start with how their policy will impact on short-term peace. And what we heard from opening government was two things, two reasons as to why local militia were so good. The first was they have local knowledge and power, as if the US doesn't have experts in Afghani politics or doesn't have people who give them information. And when it was pointed out by the opening opposition that there were alternative ways to get information, such as the provision of luxury goods, what did closing government do? They said, we support that. That's great. Let's give them even more Viagra. That's the policy that's being supported on opposition bench, not government bench. Then they said, their second level of analysis was, look at Iraq. We did this in Iraq. Isn't Iraq going great? Without responding to the point made by opening opposition, that in fact, although there had been reductions in the amount of attacks against US Army personnel, there had been increased attacks against civilians and people associated with the militia. If I could choose to have somebody attack trained soldiers or civilians, I'm going to go for the trained soldiers. So why is it that it leads to an increase in violence against civilians? Well, that's where closing opposition comes in, and we've provided you with two clear reasons as to why it leads to an increased amount of violence against civilians and the militia. The first is that you're increasing the power of that militia in the first place, right? You said, it's not that much, it's just a marginal gun. But the point of your policy is that the marginal gun does increase the power of that local militia. When we say that the local militia becomes more powerful, it's more in the interests of the Taliban to attack the militia and attack the civilians associated with it. The second thing that we've said is they're better able to identify who runs the local militia when you're shipping guns and money around the country and distributing it to them, right? Your whole point was that the Taliban controls trade supply routes and roads where they can figure out, hey, the guns are going north. Maybe the militia's up north. That's the whole point, is that you enable them to better identify who they should target in their campaigns against the local militia. And we provided you with the example. And the example was the Kurdish North in Iraq, when the US provided them with guns and funding in the 80s and 90s. We said it led to an increase of attacks against them because Saddam Hussein now had more reason to try to oppress them because they were more powerful in their sphere of influence, and he could more moreover identify particular communities where there was widespread support for the particular organisation. What's the Iranian response? The Taliban is not like Saddam Hussein. Well done, their names are different. But the whole point of your example is that the Taliban does control particular areas in Afghanistan. I don't know, as if they were a central government and controlling power. Somewhat similar to Saddam Hussein, some might say. Particularly those on opposition. Okay, so I've identified why there will be an increase in short-term instability in promoting violence against these particular local militia groups that you wanted to support, and why that will often take the effect of killing civilians, which will impact on local militia groups. We'd rather they targeted trained soldiers. Let's move on to the chances of long-term success. And what you heard from closing government is that we need a ratio of success. And they really meant a ratio. What they really meant is we need a certain number of troops in Afghanistan more, and this will help central government. Never mind the fact that those troops didn't represent central government, they represented local militia groups, so we fail to see how that adds support to central government. What we've brought to you also at Closing Opposition is an analysis of what happens when you get rid of the one shared interest. They're more likely to diverge. Why the idea of creating long-term success in Afghanistan, and when we went in, we wanted to get rid of the Taliban and create a democratic institution, will be lower in Afghanistan when you have strong local militias. And I'll take you, Max.
There is current regional instability and damaged civil society on the borders of Pakistan. Do you think militias are better or worse equipped to deal with that regional instability?
The thing is your analysis is always in the short term. As you said, look at Iraq, look what's happened in the last 6 months. Look what's happened in the last 6 months, sectarian violence has gone up, but moreover, look what's going to happen in 20 years when you've created a very powerful local militia group at the expense of support for central government and government institutions. So let's move on to establish why they're less likely to support the US in the future. The analysis from government benches was, we'll always be the highest bidder. But I thought we'd stop being the highest bidder when the Taliban weren't there, right? Because that was the point of their policy. We're going to get rid of the Taliban. If they're not there, why are we still the highest bidder? Certainly there'll be a lot less political will to buy all the drugs off the warlords, which was what closing government wanted them to do. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at what happens when the funding dries up. And Closing Opposition have pointed to you 3 fundamental reasons as to why our interests diverge at that point. The first is the source of their power has dried up. Western guns and Western money are no longer going to these local militia groups. That creates an antagonistic environment. The second thing is that we've pointed to the fact that already they are necessarily working outside the governmental institutions to achieve their ends. They're willing to take violence into their own hands, and that means that they are necessarily enemies of the concept of civil society and democratic institutions for government. The third thing that we've pointed out is they may just actually already hate the US because of historical reasons. We pointed you to the example of the Mujahideen, and they said, but that's because the Soviets started bidding away the Mujahideen. No, they didn't. The Soviet Union collapsed 2 years after they withdrew from Afghanistan. The reason why the Mujahideen don't like the US is because they happen to not, and you admitted that the CIA knew that when they funded them in the first place and gave them the power that they needed to control a country and set up terrorist camps. If you want to create long-term support for democratic and civil society institutions, why are you funding the enemies of those particular institutions in the first place? Don't pretend it's helping local government when they're not troops for local government or from central government. They're troops from local militias who share only one aim of the US, get rid of the Taliban, and that is the reason why the relationship will break down and they will not help us ultimately.
Lunch is not going to be served until 1 today. Just so you guys know, so if you guys want to watch.